In the spring of 1978, a 34-year-old cattle farmer named Earl Jensen paid $600 to lease 72 acres of ground that almost nobody in western Minnesota considered real farmland. The parcel sat low beside an old drainage ditch outside a town called Granite Falls. It flooded in wet springs, stayed soft into June, and grew a thick wall of coarse green grass that most farmers dismissed as weeds. Corn had failed there twice. Soybeans had failed there once. The previous tenant had buried a tractor up to the rear axle trying to get into the field before Memorial Day, and after paying a tow truck to pull it out, he told the owner he was finished. When the lease came up again, nobody bid on it. Nobody except Earl. At the feed store, a neighbor named Vernon Pike asked him what he planned to do with 72 acres of standing water and ditch grass. Earl said, "Feed cows." Vernon laughed. He thought Earl was joking. By February of 1981, Vernon was standing in Earl's barn asking whether he had 20 more tons of hay to sell. He did not laugh that time, but that is getting ahead of the story. To understand why Earl Jensen saw cattle feed where everyone else saw a wet field, you have to understand how he had been taught to look at a farm. Earl grew up 6 miles north of Granite Falls on a small cow-calf operation his father, Martin, had started after coming home from Korea. Martin Jensen never owned much new equipment. He had an old farmall tractor, a baler that missed knots whenever the humidity changed, and a manure spreader that leaned slightly to the left because it had rolled into a ditch in 1963. But Martin knew exactly what every animal on the place cost him. He knew how many pounds of hay a cow ate through an average winter. He knew what it cost to raise a calf to weaning weight. He knew the difference between a machine that saved labor and a machine that merely looked good sitting in the yard. He kept those numbers in a green ledger at the kitchen table. Every January, before he ordered seed or bought a bull or agreed to rent another pasture, he opened that ledger and asked one question. What does this cost per cow? Earl heard that question so often that by the time he was 14, he could calculate winter feed costs faster than he could solve anything in his school math book. Martin also taught him something that sounded simple but turned out to be the foundation of Earl's entire life. He said, "A cow doesn't care what a field looks like from the road." What he meant was that farmers sometimes confused appearance with usefulness. A straight cornfield looked productive. A new tractor looked successful. A clean fence line looked managed. But none of those things mattered if the numbers underneath them did not work. A cow cared about protein, energy, minerals, water, and enough dry matter to keep her alive through January. She did not care whether the feed came from the prettiest field in the county. Earl took over most of the daily work after his father developed heart trouble in 1972. At the time, the Jensen farm had 160 owned acres, 38 beef cows, 2 tractors, and almost no cash. It also had no land debt. Martin had paid off the original mortgage 6 years earlier, and he treated that fact like a physical structure on the farm, as real as the barn or the well. "You can lose money and recover," he told Earl. "You can lose a crop and recover. But once somebody else owns your decisions, recovery gets harder." Earl did not avoid debt completely. He was not afraid of a reasonable loan. But he never borrowed because somebody else was expanding, and he never bought equipment without knowing exactly how it would lower his cost or increase his production. That habit was what led him to the wet 72-acre parcel in 1978. Earl had driven past that ground for years. Most people saw the same thing every time they passed it: water in April, mosquitoes in June, and shoulder-high grass by July. Earl noticed something else. Even during the dry summer of 1976, when upland pastures turned brown across the county, the grass on that low ground stayed green. It was not fine grass. It was not the kind of hay buyers bragged about. But it was there, and there was a lot of it. The dominant plant was reed canary grass, a tall, aggressive grass that had already been established on the parcel for years. In some places, it was thick enough to hide a fence post. The plant tolerated wet soil better than most common forage crops, and once established, it produced a tremendous amount of material. But it came with problems. If harvested too late, it became coarse and stemmy. Cattle could sort through it, waste it, or refuse the worst parts. Its quality changed quickly as it matured. And because it could spread beyond where it was wanted, it had to be managed carefully, especially near drainage areas and natural wetlands. Earl did not see it as a miracle crop. He saw it as a resource that nobody had learned to use correctly. For 2 years, he watched the parcel through every season. He stopped beside the road in May to see when the growth started. He walked the edges in June. He cut samples with a pocket knife and dried them in paper bags in the machine shed. He talked to a county extension agent about forage maturity and feed quality. He asked a dairy farmer 20 miles away how early he cut wet ground grass. He compared what the grass looked like before the seed heads appeared and after the stems hardened. By the winter of 1977, Earl believed the field's reputation was only half right. The ground was poor for row crops. That did not make it useless. It made it poorly matched to the job everyone kept asking it to do. When the owner offered the parcel for lease the following spring, Earl agreed to pay a little over $8 an acre. Vernon Pike heard about it before Earl had even signed the paper. Vernon farmed nearly 500 acres of corn and soybeans, ran a small cattle herd, and had bought a new four-wheel drive tractor the year before. He met Earl outside the feed store and asked, "You really taking that swamp?" "It's not a swamp," Earl said. "What is it?" 72 acres of grass. That cattle won't eat. We'll see. Earl signed the lease on March 18, 1978. And then he made his first mistake. He waited too long to cut it. The spring was wet, the ground stayed soft, and Earl worried about rutting the field or getting his mower stuck. By the time he finally entered the parcel in early July, the reed canary grass was nearly 5 feet tall in some areas. The seed heads were fully developed. The stems were thick. The lower leaves had already begun to yellow. Still, the amount of material impressed him. The windrows looked enormous. The baler groaned through them. He brought home more bales than he had expected and stacked them in the north end of the hay shed. For 3 days, Earl believed he had been right. Then he fed the first bales. The cows pulled out the leaves, chewed the softer portions, and left the thick stems scattered across the lot. Some bales had heated because Earl had put them up too wet. Several developed a musty smell. The cattle ate enough to maintain themselves when Earl mixed the grass with better hay, but they wasted far more than he had calculated. By the end of winter, a deep layer of rejected stems had built up around the feed bunks. Vernon saw it when he stopped by in February. He kicked at the waste with his boot. "Looks like your cows don't know they're supposed to appreciate cheap feed," he said. Earl did not argue. He knew Vernon was right about the hay. The first harvest had been a failure. But Earl also knew the failure had given him something he did not have before: information. He had learned that yield alone meant nothing. Tons in the barn were not the same as usable feed in the animal. He had cut too late. He had treated all 72 acres as though the grass matured at the same rate. He had baled sections that were too wet, and he had built his calculations around what he harvested instead of what the cattle actually consumed. That winter, Earl went back to the green ledger. He added a new column: feed refused. He estimated the percentage of every bale the cows had wasted. Then he recalculated the real cost of the forage. It was no longer the bargain he had imagined. But it was not hopeless either. The cows had eaten the softer leaves. They had eaten more of the bales from the slightly higher sections of the field. They had eaten more when Earl mixed the grass with alfalfa and corn stalks. The problem was not simply the plant. The problem was timing, moisture, and how he used it. The next spring, Earl divided the parcel into 4 management zones. The southern edge dried first. The center held water longer. The northwest corner stayed soft even during normal summers. The ground beside the ditch produced the heaviest growth, but also matured unevenly. Instead of waiting until he could cut everything, Earl entered the southern section as soon as the soil could support the tractor. He cut the grass before the seed heads fully emerged. The stems were shorter. The leaves were softer. The windrows were lighter, but they dried faster. He came back for the center section 9 days later. He skipped the wettest corner entirely until conditions improved. He also rebuilt an old mower conditioner he bought from a retired dairy farmer for $475. The rubber rolls were worn, and one bearing sounded like gravel in a coffee can. Earl replaced the bearing, adjusted the roll pressure, welded a crack in the frame, and had the machine ready by late May. The conditioner crushed the stems and shortened drying time. That mattered on ground where 3 clear days in a row could not be taken for granted. The second year's hay looked different. It was greener. It smelled better. The stems bent instead of snapping. When Earl fed it that winter, the cows cleaned up most of it. They still preferred the alfalfa, and Earl never pretended otherwise. But mixed into the ration, the reed canary grass reduced the amount of purchased hay he needed. For the first time, the field began to do what Earl had imagined. Not replace every other feed source. Not solve every problem. Just lower the farm's dependence on expensive hay. That difference became critical in 1980. The summer started dry and stayed dry. Rain clouds formed west of town and broke apart before reaching the county. Pastures stopped growing in July. Second-cutting hay yields dropped. By August, some cattle producers were feeding hay they had planned to save for winter. By September, good hay was difficult to find. Prices climbed. Farmers who normally sold hay held on to it. Others hauled cattle to the sale barn because they did not believe they could afford to feed them through February. Earl's upland pasture suffered like everyone else's, but the wet parcel did not. The same ground that had frustrated row crop farmers held moisture beneath the dense grass. The growth slowed, but it did not stop. Earl had already taken an early cutting from the driest sections. By late summer, those areas had regrown enough for another harvest. He cut carefully, avoided the saturated edges, and left buffer areas untouched where machinery or harvesting could cause damage. By October, Earl had 186 tons of forage stored between his 2 sheds and a neighbor's empty barn. Not all of it was reed canary grass. He had alfalfa, meadow hay, oat straw, and cornstalk bales. That was the point. He had stopped searching for one perfect feed. He was building a system in which each feed did one job. The alfalfa added quality. The cornstalks added cheap bulk. The reed canary grass added dependable dry matter from land that stayed productive when the uplands dried out. Then winter arrived early. The first major snow came before Thanksgiving. By Christmas, temperatures had fallen below zero and stayed there. Cattle needed more energy just to maintain body heat. Waterers froze. Diesel fuel thickened. Snow blocked rural roads. Across the county, farmers watched their hay piles shrink faster than expected. Earl watched his shrink too, but his numbers still worked. In early January, Vernon Pike drove into Earl's yard. He shut off his truck and sat for a moment before getting out. Vernon's herd had grown to nearly 70 cows. He had expected to buy hay in December, but two sellers had backed out. One had decided to keep his hay. The other had sold it to a dairy for more money. Vernon walked into the barn, looked at Earl's stacked bales, and asked, "How much of that stuff do your cows actually eat?" "Most of it now." "You got any to spare?" Earl had already calculated what he needed through April. He had a safety margin. He could sell 20 tons without risking his own herd. So he did. Vernon paid cash. 2 weeks later, another farmer bought 12 tons. By the end of February, Earl had sold 41 tons and still had enough feed to reach spring. The money mattered, but what mattered more was what did not happen. Earl did not sell cows because feed was too expensive. He did not take out an emergency operating loan. He did not spend the winter calling hay sellers 3 counties away. The wet field had not made him rich. It had kept a bad year from becoming a crisis. That was when the story stopped being about reed canary grass. It became a story about risk. Most farmers in the area built their forage plans around normal weather. Earl began building his around the year that did not cooperate. He kept the wet parcel because it performed during dry summers. He maintained upland hay ground because it was easier to harvest in wet years. He stored more feed than his cattle were expected to need. He tracked waste, not just production. And he refused to count a bale as an asset until he knew an animal would eat it. Over the next 8 years, Earl expanded slowly. He added cows when his feed inventory supported them, not when cattle prices made expansion feel exciting. He bought used equipment and repaired it himself. He installed better drainage around the barn, but he did not try to drain the leased field or convert it into something it was not. Instead, he managed the existing stand within clear boundaries. He harvested early enough to improve feed value. He avoided moving contaminated machinery or plant material into natural areas. He left sensitive edges alone. He monitored places where the grass tried to spread beyond the established field and kept it contained. Earl understood that a useful plant in one controlled setting could create problems in another. Management was not only about getting more production. Sometimes it was about deciding where production had to stop. By 1986, Earl was running 64 cows. His machinery still looked old from the road. His pickup had rust over both rear wheels. The north hay shed leaned slightly after a windstorm, but his winter feed cost per cow was among the lowest in the area. Nobody knew that except Earl and the Green Ledger. The county was changing around him. Land prices had risen quickly in the late 1970s. Farmers borrowed to buy more acres. They financed larger tractors, combines, and grain handling systems. For a while, the expansion looked intelligent. Commodity prices were strong. Land values kept climbing. Banks treated rising acreage values as proof that more borrowing was safe. Then the direction changed. Interest rates rose. Crop prices weakened. Cattle prices moved unpredictably. Land that had been purchased at peak values no longer generated enough income to service the debt attached to it. Some farmers sold equipment. Some rented out acreage. Some lost land that had been in their families for generations. Earl knew several of them. They were not lazy. They were not foolish. Many were excellent farmers. They had simply built operations that depended on too many favorable conditions happening at the same time. Strong prices, reliable yields, affordable credit, rising land values. One failure could be managed. Several failures together could not. Earl's farm was not immune. His cattle were worth less. Fuel cost more. Repairs did not stop. But his animals still needed feed, and much of that feed came from land he rented cheaply and equipment he already owned. The low ground kept doing its job. Then, in the fall of 1987, the owner of the 72-acre parcel died. His children lived out of state and had no interest in keeping the property. They decided to sell it the following spring. When the auction notice appeared at the feed store, Vernon Pike called Earl. "You going to buy your swamp?" he asked. "Depends on the price. You've been saying that for 10 years, and it's been true for 10 years. The auction was held on a cold April morning at the American Legion Hall. The parcel attracted little interest from row crop farmers. It was still wet. It still flooded. It still had limited access. A recreational buyer wanted it for hunting. A neighboring farmer wanted the driest 20 acres but not the rest. The bidding moved slowly. At $38,000, the recreational buyer hesitated. At $40,000, Earl raised his card. The auctioneer asked for $41,000. Nobody answered. He asked again. The room stayed quiet. Then he said, "Sold to Earl Jensen." People turned toward him. They did not turn because the price was shocking. They turned because they knew Earl had spent a decade making that field pay for itself. What they did not know was how he planned to pay for it. Earl went to the bank the following morning. He placed a cashier's check for $31,000 on the loan officer's desk. That was money he had accumulated from cattle sales, hay sales, and years of lower feed costs. He borrowed the remaining amount on a short-term note secured by the parcel, not the home farm. He paid it off in less than 3 years. The field did not suddenly become more beautiful because Earl owned it. It still held water in spring. It still grew grass taller than a man's shoulder if he waited too long. It still required patience, timing, and judgment. But now the savings it created stayed attached to land he controlled. Earl farmed for another 20 years. His daughter Karen returned home in the mid-1990s after working for an agricultural cooperative in South Dakota. She had grown up stacking bales, checking cows, and watching her father write numbers in the green ledger. At first, she thought some of his methods were unnecessarily cautious. Then she began running the calculations herself. She saw that the wet field was not valuable because it produced the highest quality forage. It was valuable because it produced when other fields did not. Its strength was not perfection. Its strength was difference. When the upland field struggled, the low ground often performed. When the low ground was too wet to enter, the upland fields carried the load. The farm did not depend on one crop, one field type, or one weather pattern. That was the system Earl had spent decades building. When Karen took over daily management, she added modern forage testing and more precise feed balancing. She improved storage. She mapped the wettest sections and adjusted harvest timing based on soil conditions and plant maturity. She also strengthened the containment plan around the field because attitudes and regulations concerning invasive plants had changed. The goal was no longer simply to harvest what grew there. The goal was to use the established forage responsibly without allowing it to spread into surrounding habitats. Earl approved. He had never confused tradition with refusing to learn. In 2004, the County Cattlemen's Association asked him to speak at its winter meeting. Earl was 60 years old. He had spent more than 3 decades raising cattle. He had never become the largest producer in the county. He did not own the newest equipment. He had not built the most impressive barn. But his farm had survived drought, weak cattle markets, high interest rates, equipment failures, and winters that seemed determined to empty every hay shed in Minnesota. He stood in front of the room with no notes. Vernon Pike sat in the second row. Earl said, "Some of you remember when I leased that low ground in 1978. Several men nodded. A few of you told me it was worthless." The room laughed. Vernon raised his hand and said, "I may have used stronger language." Earl smiled. You did. Then he looked around the room. That field was bad corn ground. It was bad soybean ground. Some years, it was bad ground for driving a tractor. All of that was true. He paused. But we made the mistake of thinking that because it failed at one job, it had no job. The room became quiet. Earl continued. I cut it wrong the first year. I made hay my cows wouldn't finish. I thought a big pile of bales meant I had cheap feed. It didn't. It meant I had a big pile of something I had not learned how to use. A few people laughed again. I had to stop measuring what came off the field and start measuring what went into the cow. That line stayed with Karen. Years later, she wrote it inside the cover of the Green Ledger. Earl told the room about cutting earlier, dividing the parcel by soil conditions, mixing forage instead of asking one feed to do everything, and keeping enough inventory for the year that refused to behave normally. Then he said, that field didn't need to become drier. My operation needed to become smarter. Vernon leaned back in his chair and nodded. After the meeting, he walked up to Earl. You know what bothered me most? Vernon asked. What? You weren't lucky once. You kept being right. Earl shook his head. I wasn't right the first year. No, Vernon said. But you paid attention after you were wrong. That was closer to the truth. Earl had not seen a perfect solution hidden in a worthless field. He had seen a possibility. Then he tested it. He failed. He measured the failure. He changed the system. And he stayed with it long enough for the small advantage to matter. The 72-acre parcel is still part of the Jensen farm. Karen's son now helps manage the cattle operation. The old reed canary grass stand remains confined to the established field and is harvested according to weather, maturity, forage needs, and local management requirements. Some years it produces heavily. Some years the wettest areas are left alone. It is not treated as a miracle. It is treated as one tool inside a larger system. The original mower conditioner is gone. The north hay shed was rebuilt. The Green Ledger remains in the farm office, though most current records are stored on a computer. And on the first page, in Earl's handwriting, there is a sentence his father taught him when he was a boy. A cow doesn't care what a field looks like from the road. Most people who passed that low ground in 1978 saw water, weeds, and a history of failed crops. Earl Jensen saw a field being judged by the wrong standard. He did not ask it to grow corn. He did not ask it to look impressive. He asked it to provide dependable feed when dry ground stopped producing. Then he built an operation that knew how to use what the field could give without demanding that it become something else. That is the difference between calling land worthless and understanding what it is good for. Bad land is often just land being asked to do the wrong job. And sometimes the person who changes the job changes the future of the entire farm.